In the last two episodes, we've discussed Paul McCartney's music in the 60s, and the 60s was obviously the decade of the Beatles. But now we're going to move into the 70s, and the 70s presents a really rocky time, not only for the Beatles, but also for Paul McCartney. We get the breakup, we get the lawsuits, we get the start of 4 solo careers. And in the decade of the 70s, McCartney churns out a ton of music. So like we did in the 60s, I'm going to break it into 2 episodes. This episode will cover Paul McCartney's music from 1970 to 1975. Let's drop the needle. In September of 1969, when John Lennon came back from performing in Toronto with his Plastic Ono band, he came back into the Apple headquarters there in London and informed the other 3 Beatles that he wanted a divorce from the band. But their management at that time, Alan Klein, said, we need to keep the fact the Beatles are breaking up a secret because we are renegotiating with the record labels, so don't anybody say anything. So they didn't. In February of 1970, Alan Klein had negotiated a new contract with Capitol Records, even though earlier John Lennon had said he wanted a divorce from the group. Klein never implied that the Beatles were on the verge of breaking up. Now, this new contract required 1 compilation album per year. They picked an album they titled Hey Jude, and they picked songs that had not appeared on a previous Capitol record. The album was released worldwide, but not released in the UK until May of 1979, 9 years later. Paul sings lead on Can't Buy Me Love, Paperback Writer, Lady Madonna, and Hey Jude. Although all these songs were available as singles or on other UK releases, Apple decided it would fulfill the contractual agreement with Capitol, which sets the stage for many more compilation albums to follow. Hey Jude hit number 2 in the US. John, George, and Ringo had hired Alan Klein to be their manager, but Paul really disagreed, and he hated Klein. So Paul is sort of the lone man out in not accepting Alan Klein. This makes Paul go into a big funk, and he takes Linda and they go up to his farm in Scotland, where by his own admission he is disillusioned, disappointed, and drinks too much over what he sees as the breaking up of the Beatles. Linda says, Paul, you need to get to work. You're a musician. So with that, he moves back into his house in St. John's Woods and starts work on his solo album. For this album, Paul plays all the instruments himself, and while he's busy working at it, the other 3 Beatles over at the Apple headquarters are finally deciding that Phil Spector has finished the Let It Be album, which started out from the Get Back sessions, and that's going to be released. But there's a problem. Paul has indicated that he wants to release his album, and that would conflict with the release of the Let It Be Beatles album. So the Beatles decide to have Ringo go over and talk to Paul and ask Paul to delay the release of his album. Well, this doesn't go well at all. According to Ringo, Paul goes ballistic, shaking his finger at him and throwing him out of the house, and Paul will not agree to delay his album. So the Beatles agree to delay Let It Be. In April of 1970, McCartney does release his first solo album, and it is just called McCartney. When the album came out, it included a Q&A press release inside of it, and it was formed like questions asked to Paul about the making of the album, and in it, he was asked if he missed Ringo's drumming at all, and his answer was no. And he was asked if he could ever foresee a time where he would write with John Lennon again, and the answer was no. And then he was asked if the breakup with the Beatles was temporary or permanent, and he said he didn't know. Now, I can remember reading that on my radio station in LA at the time. This was a bombshell. And it's come out later that apparently Paul actually wrote the questions himself. So this was definitely him firing a shot at the other three Beatles. Then on the 10th of April, the British press has a headline that says, Paul quits the Beatles. The critics hated this album, but nonetheless it hit #1 in the US and #2 in the UK. Then about a month later, on May 8th, the Beatles finally do release Let It Be, which is their last album released, but was recorded before their last album recorded, which was Abbey Road. Now, if you remember the history of the Get Back sessions, originally this album was going to be called Get Back, and Glenn Johns actually did a cut of that album, and the Beatles rejected it. And so then John, George, and Ringo turned it all over to Phil Spector. Paul was not very cool about that idea, but they turned it over to Spector for him to finish and produce the album. And he did, by adding strings and choruses and all kinds of stuff on it. But the album got done in time so that it could be released along with the premiere of the movie. Paul sings lead on 3 songs: Let It Be, The Long and Winding Road, and Get Back. And he sings with John on 2 of Us, Maggie May, I've Got a Feeling, and One After 909. Now, this period has been well documented. Peter Jackson did a great, very long documentary about the Get Back sessions, and now the original film, Let It Be, has also been restored and is being released. And then in December of 1970, John Lennon releases an album called Plastic Ono Band, and it's controversial because of one song on it, which is called God, where he goes through a litany of people that he doesn't believe in. And he says very clearly, I don't believe in Beatles, and tells us all that the dream is over. In 1971, Paul releases another album, and this is his only album, which is credited to Paul McCartney and Linda McCartney. And it comes about as Paul starts legal action to dissolve the partnership that was the Beatles. The album is Ram, and it was recorded in New York with a bunch of session musicians helping Paul out. The album opens with Too Many People, which John Lennon took offense at, as he thought, and rightfully so, it was a put-down of him and Yoko. John answers it in his next album, where he has the scathing song, How Do You Sleep? Next up on Paul's album is 3 Legs, which George and Ringo thought Paul was putting them down, along with John as well. John also took offense to Dear Boy, and the back cover of the album has a photo of 2 Beatles mating. I would say that Paul was sticking it to his old mates. 2 tracks I really like are the great Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, and the overly dramatic The Backseat of My Car. Again, critics hated this album, but I liked it a lot. But Paul was not used to negative reviews from the critics, so he stopped and he said, I think I'd like to be in a band again. But one key component was that his wife, Linda McCartney, had to be part of that band. Now, Linda was not a trained musician, but that didn't stop Paul from forming the band and including Denny Sywell, who'd played with him on Ram, and then recruiting Denny Lane from the Moody Blues, who he had known for years. And he decides he'll call the band Wings, because that's a vision that came to him when he was waiting for Linda to give birth to his daughter Stella, and it was a troubled birth, and he had this vision of angels' wings. So that became the name of his new group. Wings releases their first album, Wildlife, in 1971. Now, Paul wanted this to be a raw-sounding album, almost as if the band were live, and a lot of these were early takes, not a whole lot of rehearsing. There are some strange songs on this album. There is the lightweight Bip Bop, I'm Your Singer, and Dear Friend. Wildlife went to number 10 in the US and 11 in the UK, but the critics did not like it. They thought the songs were all very lightweight, and many of them really took exception to Linda being part of the band. Paul next decides that the band needs to go on the road, and so in 1972, he fleshes out the band with the addition of Henry McCullough, and they decide to do a tour of universities throughout England. In trying to establish Wings as their own act, notably on this tour, they play no Beatles songs. In 1973, the band Wings actually gets a new name, which is Paul McCartney and Wings, and they release an album called Red Rose Speedway. I like the opening, Big Barn Bed, the big hit, My Love, Get on the Right Thing, and the medley of Hold Me Tight, Lazy Dynamite, Hands of Love, and Power Cut. Critic reaction is a little bit better. Now it's lukewarm towards this outing. But the album goes to number 5 in the UK, and it does hit number 1 in the US. But although Paul is trying to move on from the Beatles, Alan Klein decides to cash in on their catalog of songs, and he releases 2 double albums, which are referred to as the Red Album, which is their music from 63 through 66, and the Blue Album, which is their music from 67 through 70. Both records are big hits, with the Blue Album outselling the Red one. For Paul's next album, he decides to make it an adventure. And he's come up with this idea that they're all going to go to Lagos, Africa to record this record. Well, just before they're to leave, Denny Sewell and Henry McCullough decide to leave the band, which leaves Paul, Linda, and Denny Lane as a trio. Undaunted, Paul says, "We're going anyway." And so they do. But when they get there, it's a mess. The studio, most of the stuff doesn't work. The microphones are horrible. And they're living there, and Paul and Linda, not really thinking about their safety, decide to walk home from the studio one night, where they are robbed at knife point. And included in that robbery was a briefcase that had all of Paul's demo tapes and lyrics of songs that they had just recorded. So Paul had to do everything from memory, and they had to re-record the album, or at least those songs, again. As they were re-recording, Paul started feeling very ill in the studio, and it was decided he needed to get outside to get some fresh air, and when he walked outside, he collapsed. Now, Linda thought he was having a heart attack, but what he was having was a bronchial spasm which came on from too much smoking. After leaving Africa, they come back to London to do some overdubs, and with all the problems that they had in recording this record, it has become Paul McCartney's most successful album to date. And of course, the album is called Band on the Run. It's released in November of 1973. It's terrific, from the epic Band on the Run opening, to the hit single Jet, to Mrs. Vanderbilt, to the John Lennon sounding Let Me Roll It, I Like No Words, Picasso's Last Words Drink to Me, and 1985. The album started out slow. It got to number 9 in the UK and 7 in the US. But in the US, they decided to include the single Helen Wheels. And because of that single, the album picked up again. And this time, it goes all the way to number 1, both in the US and the UK. And the critics loved this album. Paul McCartney was back. Then in 1975, Paul releases his next album with Wings called Venus and Mars. And for it, he recruits Jimmy McCullough on guitar and Jeff Britton on drums. Now, when I first heard this album, this is a great album. And when I first heard it, in my mind, I could envision Paul doing this whole album on stage. And I sort of became the stage manager, the lighting director. I knew where the members of the band would be for each song and what lighting cues there would be. I had this all worked out in my head. It opens with Venus and Mars. Then it segues into Rock Show. There's also the great Magneto and Titanium Man, Letting Go, Medicine Jar, a rare Denny Lane vocal, Call Me Back Again, and the hit, Listen to What the Man Said. The album hit number 1, both in the US and the UK, but during the recording, Jeff Britton, the drummer, quits and is replaced by Joe English. Then in the summer of 1975, they hit the road, and I got to see them when they played in LA. It was a terrific show. although the lighting effects and the stage direction was not what I had originally seen in my head. Nonetheless, everybody had a great time. While they're on tour, Paul decides they will record an album, which they do, which is called Wings at the Speed of Sound. Tracks include Let Them In, Beware My Love, Why No Junko, co-written and sung by Jimmy McCullough. Paul had wanted the band to be more democratic, so everybody gets to do a song. You got Denny Lynn singing To the Note You Never Wrote and Time to Hide, and Linda gets Cook of the House, and even Joe English takes a turn on Must Do Something About It. The album also includes the hit Silly Love Songs. It reaches number 1 in the US and number 2 in the UK. The tour produces a terrific triple live album called Wings Over America. This album really gives you a good documentation of what it was like to hear Paul McCartney during this tour at this point of his career. And the album reaches number 1 in the US, making it the 5th consecutive Wings album to do so. After the tour, Wings decides to take a break, and Jimmy McCullough and Joe English leave the band. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. So in the years between 1970 and 75, the Beatles break up, Paul goes out as solo, and then he forms the band Wings to great success. In those 5 years, he releases 11 albums. This is a very busy guy. In our next episode, we'll look at what he does between 75 and the end of the decade. Thanks for watching, and keep a rockin'.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.